Welcome back to the Python tutorial series. I'm so glad you're here. This is the 45th video in the series, and today we will go over what closures are in Python. We will first go over what nested functions are, then we will write closures in Python. Finally, we will write a real-world example of a closure. So let's get started. I created a file called nestedfunctions.py, and I'm going to create an outer function called outerFunction. And it's going to have one parameter, text. And then inside of this, I'm going to create an inner function that has no parameters. And the inner function will print the text. And then in the outer function, I'm going to call the inner function. And then I'm going to call the outer function and say hello world. And it prints hello world because the outer function is hello world, and then it calls the inner function which prints text. And that's how that looks. Now let's do another example of nested functions where we return a value. I'm going to create a function called pop, and it's going to take in list1. Eventually we're going to create a list, and it will eliminate the last element of the list, like the .pop method does, but this is just to show how it would work as a nested function. Then I'm going to create an inner function called getLastElement, and it's going to take in list2, and then I'm going to return the last element of list1, which is list1, then the length of list2 minus 1. Because indexing in Python starts at 0, so we have to subtract 1. Then back into the outer function, I'm going to do list1.remove, and then I'm going to call getLastElement, and then the parameter will be list1. Then I'll print list1 and return list1. I'm then going to create a list of numbers and set that equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then I'm going to call the function pop and pass in list of numbers. And I'll call that function twice, so now when I run this, it eliminates 6, then it eliminates 5 from the list and prints out the respective lists. So that's how nested functions work. Now that we know how nested functions work, we can now move into closures. I created a file called closures.py and pasted the first example from before. So for closures, we don't explicitly call the inner function, so I'll remove the parentheses there, and we'll want to return the inner function. So if I were to run this, nothing would happen. I'm then going to set myfunc equal to outerFunction, and then the variable myfunc is actually a function. So if I have open and closed parentheses and now run this, it will print hello world like before. And that's how closures work. What's nice about closures is that, let's say I delete the outer function, it will still work because I already set myfunc equal to the outer function, so it doesn't need the outer function anymore because it has that stored in myfunc and can then run the inner function. However, if I were to delete outer function before myfunc, that would cause an error. I'm then going to create another closure called power, and it's going to take in an exponent. And then inside of this, I'll create a function called power_of that takes in a base, and then I'll return pow, base, and then exponent. And then finally, I'll return power_of, and I don't need the parentheses. Then if I set cube equal to power3, and then print cube2, cube3, cube4, and cube5, it will output the respective values. And there we go. It prints out 8, 27, 64, and 125, which are 2 cubed, 3 cubed, 4 cubed, and 5 cubed. So that's the basics of closures in Python. Now let's do a real-world example of a closure. I created a file called loginclosures.py, and imported the logging library and set up the basic configuration. Now I'm going to create a function called logger, and it's going to take in a function. Then I'm going to create an inner function called logfunc, and it's going to take in any number of arguments. I'll put star args, and star means any number, so any number of arguments. And then I'll do logging.info, and then I'll say what function is running, and then what arguments it's running with. And then I'll format it accordingly. Then I'll print the args, and then return log func. So then I'm gonna create some basic functions, one called add and one called subtract, and it's gonna add and subtract two numbers. Then I'm gonna create a variable called addLogger and set that equal to logger add, and same thing for subtraction. I'm gonna create a variable called subtraction logger and set that equal to log subtract. Now I'll run addLogger by doing addLogger 3, 3, and I'll run subtraction logger by doing subtraction logger 8, 3. And now when I run this, it should work, and it prints out 6 and 5, because 3 plus 3 is 6, and 8 minus 3 is 5. So you might say, I could have done that just by calling the add and subtract functions. However, what this did was create a log. So it created a file called example.log, and it said running add with arguments 3, 3, and running subtract with arguments 8, 3. So this just logs what functions ran and shows what a closure does. And this logging can actually be done with decorators, and I'll link the video to decorators above. And that's an overview of closures in Python. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to follow along with this video series by subscribing and hitting the notification bell, or by clicking on the next video so that you can expand your knowledge about Python. And as always, I can't wait to see you next time.